Hi, everyone. We're going to begin our webinar now. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm very pleased to present a webinar on microbiota transplant therapy for adults with autism. We have some exciting results to share with you. I'm Professor James Adams at Arizona State University, and with me are my colleagues, Rosa Krajmalnik-Brown, Dr. Richard Frye, and Dr. Khemlal Nirmalkar. If you want more information about our research, you can go to our website here, autism.asu.edu. Before we get started, we have to make a couple disclosure announcements. Several of us have pending or approved patents related to the use of microbiota transplant or probiotics for a variety of conditions, including autism and Pitt Hopkins. Several of us have received research funding from companies for our microbiota research. Several of us have also been consultants for companies doing microbiota research. We need to point out that microbiota transplant therapy is an investigational treatment and is not approved by the FDA for autism. That's why we're doing the research studies to try to get it approved. Also, in order to move ahead with the next stage of the studies, two of us, myself and Rosa Krajmalnik-Brown, and a couple other people have formed a company, Gut-Brain Axis Therapeutics, in which we are using that company to receive investments from investors so we can continue research in this area to get MTT approved for autism and for Pitt Hopkins. And finally, two of us are part owners of Autism Diagnostics, which is developing metabolomics tests for diagnosing and treating autism. And we have several patents there as well. So with that, let me turn it over to my collaborator, Professor Rosa Krajmalnik-Brown. She's the director of the Health Through Microbiome Center at ASU and has also been my close collaborator for a dozen years. Rosie?
Thank you, James. So one of the centers of this story and the superstar of this story is the gut microbiome. The gut microbiome is unique to each individual. There's generally stability through life, and I have general in quotations because we're going to show you today that with certain interventions, it can be changed. It's affected by internal and external factors in our body and the environment. It's altered in disease, and we also know that it's strongly affected by residence time. If a child has constipation or if a child has diarrhea, the microbiome will be very, very different because of the timing that the microbes have to reside in the gut. The microbial genomes, or all the genomes sequenced from microbes that live in our body, constitute more than 100 times more genes than the human genome. What that means is that at the gene level, we're 1% human and 99% microbe. Next. Because we are at the gene level 1% human and 99% microbe, that provides a big opportunity to influence the human as a whole by changing this microbiome. So the gut microbiome has been associated with many diseases and disorders, which are listed on the left side of this slide. And if we can manage the microbiome in a positive way, we can potentially have huge impact, better metabolism, better gastrointestinal health, behavior, less obesity, perhaps reduce type 2 diabetes, and the microbiome also affects drug activity. Next. At the center of this slide, you can see a cartoon of a community of microbes. These microbes, which is a cartoon for the gut microbiome, interact with you can see DNA there, which is epigenetics with the host. They interact with the environment. They interact with the food that we consume, and they also interact with any drugs or medicines that we put in our body. And so this is really important because if you think about the theology for autism, for example, all the components that are here interacting with the microbiome are also components that have been associated with the etiology of autism. So the microbiome is at the center, either contributing, helping, or maybe reacting to all these other aspects that are contributing to the etiology of the disorder. Next. Microbiome and autism research has been going on for many years. Jim and I were some of the first, and not the only ones, to study this question. And there have been many studies and different findings. I don't want to neglect that many other groups also have looked at this question: is the microbiome, the gut microbiome, different in autism and typically developing children? But there's a few findings that replicate in many studies, and one of them is increase of harmful microbes like Suterella and Clostridia, or microbes that are just specifically found in this population. And the other thing, which was a big focus of Jim and Dr. Adams and my research, which is the lack of beneficial microbes. So in our very early studies, we found that children in the spectrum have a lack of microbes that can do fermentation. For example, Prevotella is one of them, and other beneficial microbes like Bifidobacterium and Lactobacillus. And they all had lower diversity. So they had a lesser amount of the types of microbes, a lesser amount of different microbes in their gut. Next. Another important factor that motivated research is that about 40% children and adults with ASD have chronic gut problems, constipation, diarrhea, pain. As I mentioned in one of my earlier slides, these affect the microbiome and can also be affected by the microbiome. And this often lasts for many years. A few years ago, Dr. Adams published a paper where he showed that gut problems are associated with worse autism symptoms. In this figure, you can see on the y-axis ATEX subscores. The higher the number, the more severe the diagnosis for autism it is. And on the y-axis, on the x-axis, you see two groups, one that has low GSI, which has gastrointestinal symptoms, and one that has high GSI, which is, again, the higher gastrointestinal symptoms. You can see that the darker bars, which are the ones with the higher gastrointestinal symptoms, have higher scores also on the autism symptoms in this graph. Next. So we, motivated by these factors and by the research that we did before, where we saw that one of the things that was affecting the children was the lack of beneficial microbes, we designed a microbiota transplant therapy, and we ran an open label study with 18 children. This was a phase 1 study run at ASU. The base of the study was 2 weeks of vancomycin, 1 day fasting bowel cleanse, 1 to 2 days high dose microbiota, 7 to 8 weeks maintenance microbiota, which was a lower dose than the one provided in the first 2 days. And on this research, we saw very big success and very promising results. Initial 80% reduction of gastrointestinal symptoms, 23% reduction of ASD symptoms also initially, and bacterial diversity increased. I'll show you some of those results in the coming slides. The microbiota product that we used was purified 99% bacteria from very healthy donors, and this was provided by our collaborators, Alex Korutz and Mike Sadowski at the University of Minnesota. Next. So here are the results showing you how MTT improved GI and ASD symptoms and how this remained even after 2 years. So on the left, you can see a graph that on the y-axis, we have GSRS, which is a measurement of GI symptoms. Again, the higher the value, the more GI symptoms are present. A value of 1 is the normal gut. And here you can see at baseline, our children had a lot of GI symptoms. After 10 weeks of treatment, those GI symptoms were reduced significantly. Some of these benefits were lost after 8 weeks and 2 years of follow-up. However, even after 2 years, the GI symptoms overall are much better, and we still see 58% improvement. If we look at ASD symptoms improved 23% initially, but when we look at 2 years, which is what this figure is showing, there was 47% reduction in symptoms. And you can see here that at baseline, most of the children that were enrolled in our trial had severe symptoms. We're in this category, red, of severe symptoms. And when we look at the 2 years follow-up, only a few, if I remember correctly, this is 2 children were on the severe category. And the majority were the mild to moderate symptoms, and some of them even with minimal to no symptoms reported. This was close to 50% of the population we treated. Thanks to these exciting results, FDA granted fast track status to MTT for ASD. Next. What happened to the microbes as we saw these improvements in behavior and in GI symptoms? In the left figure, I'm showing you a figure that shows the diversity. Phase PD is a measurement of diversity in the beginning of the treatment. Here's, you can see on the left, week 0, the median of the children that we treated was much lower than the green line, which is our typically developing children controls, which we compare to, and the orange lines are our donors. You can see that after 3 weeks, there was not a huge increase in diversity, but this is expected because these children received 2 weeks of vancomycin. But at week 10, we can see that the diversity starts increasing. And at week 18, which is our follow-up, the diversity has reached the levels of or typically developing controls. And 2 years later, that diversity is even higher, which was really, really exciting. If we look at how similar or participants were to the donor they received the microbiota from, that's what this graph is showing you on the right, the UniFrac weighted factor, the UniFrac on weighted factor. UniFrac is a measurement of dissimilarity. The lower the number, the more similar things are to what we're comparing them. And so the green line, which are the typically developing controls, that's you can see that's like the average of how similar you would be to the person sitting next to you. And we can see that after treatment, just after vancomycin, the children to be treated were already a little bit more similar to the donors. And after 10 weeks of treatment, also they were more similar to their donors than to anyone else. After 8 weeks follow-up, even though they were more similar to the donors, that was starting to be lost. And 2 years later, we can see that they're not any more similar to their donors than they are to anyone else. But we can see that this was actually a healthier microbiota. We can see that based on the diversity and other data that we have on specific microbes, and that they probably were able to, we changed the environment in the gut, and these children were able to recruit and retain the beneficial microbes, and they had their own individualized beneficial microbiome. Next. I'll pass it to my collaborator, Dr. Jim Adams.
Thanks, Rosie, for summarizing the results of our child study. Now we want to move on to our new results for today, which is the phase 2 study for adults with autism. So we designed the study for 84 adults with autism. This is funded by the federal government. However, COVID and several other challenges delayed our study and increased the cost. Luckily, 1,000 plus autism families, including many fearfully wonderfully made families, donated an extra $200,000 to us to allow us to continue the study and ultimately enroll and treat 56 adults with autism. The results are less statistically significant than if we had our original goal of 84, but still, you'll see that many of our results are still significant or marginally significant with good effect size. So I'll be focusing on the effect size in presenting the data. So our study design is a rigorous, randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled study. Our phase 1 study was open label, so there was some placebo effect. Here, we're controlling for placebo effect. So group A gets the real treatment, the vancomycin, bowel cleanse, and 8 weeks of microbiota. And then in part 2, they get another 8 weeks of microbiota. We wanted to see if an extra 8 weeks would help them more. And then we observed them for another 18 months. Group B received a placebo and then a bowel cleanse, because you can't hide the fact you're getting a bowel cleanse. But then in part 2, then they're switched to the real treatment, meaning they get another bowel cleanse, but then 8 weeks of microbiota. They don't receive vancomycin because the FDA wanted us to check, is vancomycin needed or not? Vanco helps kill bad bacteria, but also kills some good bacteria. And then we observe them for 18 months also. So today we're going to be presenting the results of part 1 and part 2. Part 3, the long-term observation, is still running, and that will finish in September. We did have very few dropouts in this study, which is very encouraging. Our first phase 1 study had 0 dropouts. This study, we had 3 dropouts due to lack of interest in the adults with autism. Their parents wanted to continue, but the adults chose to drop out. We had 1 dropout in Group A and 2 in Group B. We had 1 family we had to withdraw because they made a medication error. And then 1 family, the child did not have breakfast in the morning. They went to a grocery store and lost consciousness. Could have been just fainting, could have been an absent seizure, but an ambulance took them to the hospital. In the ambulance, they woke up and were fine. The ER doc said it was fine for them to continue in the study, but a human subjects board said no, we had to withdraw them. So we did have 1 withdrawal due to adverse effect. So in total, we had 51 people complete the treatment, which is a very high completion rate. In terms of adverse effects, there were no serious, meaning life-threatening adverse effects, no AEs that were potentially life-threatening, only the 1 dropout that I mentioned due to an AE. The vancomycin group had 52 adverse effects, meaning slight fluctuations in terms of could be as little as 1 day where they had slightly worse symptom of some type. The most common AEs were temporary worsening of existing symptoms, primarily hyperactivity and irritability, usually only lasting a few days. So slightly more adverse effects in the vanco group than the placebo, which we were expecting because as the vancomycin kills off harmful bacteria, they could be releasing all their toxins at once. But the microbiota capsules is fascinating to see. They resulted in fewer adverse effects than placebo. That the group receiving microbiota capsules had primarily some days of some reports of irritability, some reports of constipation. The placebo group had more adverse effects reported, more diarrhea, bloating, irritability, abdominal pain, hyperactivity. So in general, it seems that those receiving the real microbiota had fewer days, fewer bad days. So if you're a parent of a child with autism, you know your child can have their good and bad days, and the ones in the microbiota had fewer bad days. And those, the severity of those AEs was rated on a mild, moderate, or severe scale, and they had lower severity of those AEs as well. So even though they had a bad day, it was not as bad. We did blood safety testing throughout the study. There were no major changes in liver function, kidney function, or any of the other parts of the metabolic panel, except for a very slight change, glucose, a 3% decrease, which is not clinically significant. And there were no change in complete blood cell count. So red blood cells, white blood cell counts, very safe. And again, that's because the vancomycin stays in the gut and we're giving healthy gut bacteria. So overall, these blood safety tests suggest very good safety, no significant concerns, which is great. In terms of outcome measures, primary outcome measure was the Childhood Autism Rating Scale, which is equally valid for adults, and that's rated by our expert evaluators at ASU, and Dr. Frye rated it at the site he directed at Phoenix Children's Hospital. And then we also used several secondary measures, daily stool record, social responsiveness scale, and aberrant behavior checklist, which the parents rated. And so for the Childhood Autism Rating Scale, we saw that the treatment group in part 1 improved about twice as much as the placebo group. And so that was almost statistically significant, P of 0.06. That means we're 94% confident that there's greater improvement in Group A than in Group B. And that's a medium effect size. But what we discovered to our surprise is that 8 weeks wasn't enough to treat the adults, that they needed longer than the children to be treated, presumably because they'd had these GI problems longer. And so in part 2, when we gave them an extra 8 weeks of treatment, there was more improvement. Now we have to be cautious that at the end of part 1, we did break the blind, let them know that now we're going to give extra treatment to Group A and begin treating Group B. We've already accounted for placebo effect somewhat in part 1, but there might be some additional placebo effect. But again, the impression of our expert evaluators is that there was substantially more improvement in the treatment group when they received an extra 8 weeks of treatment, and the placebo group, when they were switched to the real treatment, had more improvement as well. And so if we look at the combined effect, we compare groups A and B at the end of part 2 to placebo in part 1, we get a P of 0.0001 and an effect size of 0.79, which is a large effect size. So this suggests that 8 weeks of microbiota helps some, but 16 weeks helps even more. And it seems the adults seem to need longer treatment than children. Again, we would need to redo this study with a randomized placebo-controlled arm of 16 weeks to be sure, but it certainly seems likely the effect size is large. If we look at the daily stool record, what we did is we had parents count every day if their child had an abnormal day. An abnormal day was defined as having no stool, or having a very hard stool, a very soft or liquid stool, or having 4 or more stools, or requiring a GI medication like enema or laxative, or if they were just having significant pain related to their gut. And so we saw that compared to baseline, group A, the treatment group, had a 38% reduction in days of number of abnormal days over 14 days, and the placebo group had only half as much improvement, 17%. So P of 0.05, a medium effect size. And then when we continued treatment, the GI symptoms by then had stabilized for the treatment group, but the placebo group, when they were switched to the real treatment, had a little more improvement. So it seems the GI symptoms improve first, and the autism symptoms improve a bit more later, and that was consistent with what we saw in our phase 1 study. The primary improvements in the daily stool record were reduced days of pain and reduced days of soft stool. So if we look at that, we see in terms of days of pain, days of significant pain, the treatment group had an 85% reduction in days of pain. The placebo group had a 41% reduction in days of pain. And then in part 2, the extra treatment, again, the treatment group continued to have minimal days of pain, and the placebo group, not too much additional change. If we look at days of soft stool, the treatment group had a 73% reduction in days of soft stool. The placebo group had only a 21% change, so moderate trend toward significance. And then in part 2, the days of soft stool continued to be minimal for the treatment group. And when the placebo group was switched to the real treatment, they had fewer days of soft stool as well. So overall, very encouraging. If we look at another measure of autism symptoms, the social responsiveness scale, this one rated by the families, they said roughly twice as much improvement in the treatment group as the placebo, but it's not statistically significant. It's a bit of fluctuation. But then at the end of part 2, the parents report more improvement in autism-related symptoms, social communication, and the placebo group, when they're switched to treatment, the parents perceived more improvement as well. So the degree of improvement approached a medium to large effect size, statistically significant compared to part 1. If we look at the aberrant behavior checklist, which looks at a number of aberrant behaviors, including hyperactivity, irritability, and others, we see that here, initially, there's not too much difference between the two groups, not statistically significant, but the placebo group did improve a little bit more. But then at the end of part 2, now both groups report there has been substantial improvement of both of them, about a 30% improvement. So not every score improved more for treatment than placebo, but the majority of them did. Finally, if we look at the parent global impressions of autism, this is a report of an average of 20 different symptoms. We see that the parents reported roughly almost twice as much improvement in the treatment group than the placebo. And then at the end of part 2, there was somewhat more improvement for the treatment group, and the placebo group switched to the real treatment also had more improvement, ending up with a small to medium effect size and marginal statistical significance. If we look specifically at which of those 20 symptoms improved the most, GI was one of the biggest improvements. Initially 35% reduction in GI symptoms for the treatment group, much less for the placebo. And then when additional treatment was given, more improvement in GI symptoms, and the placebo group switched to the real treatment, had more improvement as well. So medium to large effect size. If we look at all 20 symptoms and look at how much improvement there was, it turns out tantrums were the biggest improvement. So orange means there's a 65% reduction in the treatment group, and the placebo group had only a 25% reduction. If we then look at GI, again, 50% improvement in GI versus 20% for placebo. For all the other measures, I won't go through all of them, but you see in all of them, the orange bar is higher than the blue bar, meaning the treatment group improved more on all of the 20 measures compared to the placebo group. And the improvements were significantly different in terms of GI, receptive language, and an average of all 20 symptoms. There were also marginally significant improvements in tantrums, stimming, and cognition. If we had a larger number of participants as we planned, probably more of these responses could have been significant. So just to summarize, in part 1, we saw on our primary outcome measure, the CARS, good, medium effect size and almost statistically significant, P of 0.06, and the daily stool record, P of 0.05, and again, medium effect size. And then if we look in part 2, we saw the effect sizes generally are larger and many more of these changes are statistically significant. So overall, I won't go through this all in detail, but I'll just say overall, this is very promising for our primary outcome, one of our secondary outcomes. MTT has at least a moderate effect size, and we believe that longer treatment is better, and more frequent dosing we think is going to result in greater improvement. So there's still a lot of opportunity to improve the dosing and improve outcomes farther. It's exciting to see that we weren't sure we could help adults who had had these GI symptoms for some cases several decades, and they were able to be improved. So now I want to move it on to Dr. Frye, who led one of our 2 sites. He led the site at Phoenix Children's Hospital, and he's going to give you reports on 2 special case studies. Dr. Frye.
Thanks, Dr. Adams. Yeah, I'd like to highlight 2 cases. We picked 2 cases that were very diverse, just to show you that that this treatment seems to be helpful for a wide variety of children with autism. The first case here is a 25-year-old woman. She was normally developing until she was 18 months of age and then suddenly lost skills. She had regressive type autism. She recovered pretty well and graduated high school with a certificate. And her IQ was actually pretty good. If you look at the bottom, her nonverbal IQ was 119, which is high average. Her GI symptoms started at 7 years of age, and they started to progress from there. At 17, she started to have chronic abdominal pain and heartburn, and that was getting worse. She also suffered from chronic headaches and teeth grinding. Next slide. So here you can see the CARS score. This is an overall score of autism severity, and I've labeled them as the rating ranges for the autism symptoms. And we can see that at baseline, she started at severe. She had severe autism symptoms. And at the end of the double-blind placebo control portion, or phase 1, and she did receive the product, she actually was right at the cusp of severe to mild to moderate. And then as we went on and she went into the open label, her score dropped down into mild to moderate. And with longer term, she got much better until she was actually at minimal symptoms of autism at 18 months. So she improved substantially. Next slide. We can also look at two of the other measures that were completed, the parent-rated symptoms, and we can see that that started out high, and then with treatment, it actually decreased substantially, as did the GI rating scale, decreased substantially over the treatment period and into follow-up. Next slide. So the second case is somewhat different. This is a 23-year-old male, and this young man was normally developing until 18 months of age and then suddenly lost skills. He had regressive type autism, but his GI symptoms started much earlier on in life. It started at 6 weeks of age, where he had chronic diarrhea, which improved over time from 10 to 12 stools per day to 3 to 4 stools per day. So even at his best, he was still having quite a few stools per day, and his bowel movements were not normal. They started out as white and turned to gray, but they were not normal. He was diagnosed with food allergies to gluten and dairy, and he had an abnormal EEG, but only had 2 seizures in his life. The last one was 3 years before the study. He was intellectually disabled with a nonverbal IQ of 50. Next slide. Like the previous case, he started out with a CARS score in the very severe range, but he improved actually much more rapidly. By the end of phase 1, where he did receive the product, he was in the mild to moderate range, and by the end of the open label portion, phase 2, he was actually down to minimal symptoms, where he stayed for the most part until follow-up.
Thank you very much, Dr. Frye. So just to summarize then, Rosie, would you like to go ahead and discuss the microbiota?
Yes. So why is MTT successful? We don't know exactly why, but we can tell you what are some of the things that the gut microbiome does, and those are some of the possibilities of why this treatment was so successful. And so gut bacteria have many effects. These effects include they help us digest our food. They help us get extra calories from our food. They produce vitamins. They produce short-chain fatty acids. One of them is butyrate when we digest fiber. And butyrate is actually the food for our intestinal cells. It's the energy for our intestinal cells. They prevent overgrowth of harmful bacteria and yeast. This is very important. When you have more beneficial microbes, they outcompete the bad microbes, which is important. They also regulate the immune system. We also know that we also have harmful bacteria that cause GI problems, constipation, diarrhea, bloating, and pain. So having a balance where we have more beneficial microbes can help get rid of this bad bacteria. And these bad bacteria also produce toxins, which affect the gut, body, and brain. And altogether, the bacteria in our gut produce metabolites, produce chemicals that are either neuroactive molecules or precursors of neurotransmitters. So that's really important too. And so we know that through our studies, we've seen that MTT eliminates some of the harmful bacteria and actually provides beneficial bacteria from very healthy, carefully screened donors that help fight out those non-beneficial microbes. Next. And so I'm showing you here the data that shows some of the things that I just told you. So I showed you the diversity on our first trial, and this figure is very similar to the one we show you. Phase PD shows diversity. It's a measurement of diversity. The higher the number, the better, the more diverse the gut is. And you can see here first on the left, which is group A, the group that got treated. After they got vancomycin, the diversity goes down. And after the treatment, you can see that the diversity goes up. Some of you might be thinking, but I saw on your previous slides on the phase 1 that the diversity was already going up after vanco. When we measure after vanco on our first trial, it was after vanco and after the first inoculation. So we were already measuring some response of the microbes. But we knew that, so we designed this better. And that vanco point is really while the adults are taking just vanco, there has been no addition of microbes. So you can see that after vanco, without addition of microbes, the diversity goes down. Once we add the microbes, the diversity goes up. You can also see on the right side, the group B, which is the placebo, there are no real changes on baseline the point of Banco, which there was no Banco or the first point, but after these patients got treated, which is that very last point, there was a slight increase in diversity. Not a huge change, but slight increase in diversity. Next. So we also wanted to see how similar they become to the donor. This is a measurement similar to UniFrac, which I showed you before. The lower the number, the better, because then they're more similar to the donor. You can see that we have on red at baseline or patients after vancomycin, they become less similar to the donor and to anyone else because their microbiota has just been smashed with antibiotics. But then after treatment, they become more similar. At MTT1, the blue bar and the green bars they're more similar to the donor, which is what we expected to see. And you can see that on group B, on our brown and orange E bars, nothing's changing, which is what we expect because they're taking placebo. But after they get the drug, the bar is lower, which is what we expect to see. They're more similar to the donor. Next. Okay, this figure is a PKA analysis where each dot that you're seeing is the overall microbiome of an individual at one time point in our study. On the right side, you can see the placebo, and you can see that nothing groups. One of the things that happens in these diagrams also is that the closer the dots are, the more similar they are to each other. The only thing that you see grouping on the right is some green dots on the bottom, which it's actually our donors. And so they're pretty similar. On the left side, I want you to first pay attention to the red dots in the middle of the graph. The red dots and the orange dots in the middle of the graph, those are our individuals at baseline before they were treated. On the left side, you see some blue and yellow that says vancomycin. So all of our individuals look really similar after they got vancomycin. But then after vancomycin, they split into two different groups because we had drug from two different sources. On the bottom, you can see a pink circle, which are our Finch recipients. And on the top, you can see blue, which are more similar to our University of Minnesota donors. So here, I'm showing you that the microbiota does change, does diverge, but I'm also showing you that the source matters, that depending on where the source of the microbiota comes, it might become two different groups. Next. We also saw improvements in beneficial bacteria, and I'm showing you one here that it's really exciting, Bifidobacterium, which is beneficial microbes, many times included in probiotics. On the left side, you can see on our group that was treated, first the red bar had a low number of Bifidobacteria. Purple is after vancomycin, so it looks like vancomycin got rid of many microbes and reduced some of these Bifidobacteria. But after we added our treatment, on the blue you can see a huge increase in Bifidobacteria, and also on the green, the Bifidobacterium was 100x compared to baseline after treatment. And you can also see on the right that when we look at the placebo, the brown and the orange, there's not a big increase in Bifidobacteria. There's actually a little bit of a loss at some point. But when we add the drug, Bifidobacteria increases also dramatically. So these are really great news that we're actually increasing beneficial microbes. In summary, with the microbiome data that I show you, you can see that vancomycin changes the microbiome dramatically, reducing diversity. This is not new. Other researchers have shown that. We just kind of replicated that through our study. Our microbiota capsules restore that diversity and shift the microbiome towards the donor. And we see some beneficial bacteria that get affected and get increased, which is great news, including Bifidobacterium. We also saw that pretreatment with vancomycin possibly results in greater improvement in microbiome, and we will continue to assess during our long-term follow-up if vancomycin was really necessary or not. Well, this I'll pass it back to Dr. Jim Adams. Thank you.
Thanks, Rosie. So just to summarize, we just found that microbiota transplant therapy for adults was safe and effective. This is a very rigorous study, randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled. In terms of safety, the microbiota capsules resulted in fewer adverse effects than placebo, safer than placebo, no problems found with blood safety test. It was very effective that in part 1, the treatment group improved more than the placebo on the primary outcome, autism symptoms, and on one secondary outcome, the daily stool record, the moderate effect size. But then in part 2, when we gave additional treatment, there was additional improvement, that the adults seemed to need longer treatment than the children. That 16 weeks of treatment was more effective than 8 weeks for the adults. So the exciting news is these results are strong enough, we believe, to justify a phase 3 study. And a phase 3 study is the final step in FDA approval. Also, we believe, based on interpreting our results and based on the microbiome evaluations by Dr. Rosa and Dr. Khem, that improved dosing is going to help us yield even better results, we believe. In addition, I want to tell you briefly about a second study we did for children with Pitt Hopkins. Pitt Hopkins is a severe neurodevelopmental disorder. It's caused by a single mutation or deletion of a gene. It affects about 1,400 people in the US, mostly children who've been diagnosed. It involves severe autism, severe intellectual disability, severe physical disability. Most of these children cannot talk. Their IQ is about that of a 1-year-old. Most of them cannot walk. They're mostly in wheelchairs. But the biggest quality of life issue for them is 70% of them suffer from chronic constipation, generally lifelong. And so we conducted the first clinical trial ever done for children with Pitt Hopkins. And that was a microbiota transplant study, similar to the way we designed our study for adults, and that it was randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled. Well, we only treated for 8 weeks. We thought that would be enough for these children. We had hoped to enroll 20 children, but we discovered most of these children were so severe, so impaired physically and mentally, they could not swallow capsules intact. So we had to we could only enroll 7 participants, and one of them could swallow a pill, but could not swallow multiple pills. So she dropped out the first few days. We did have 6 children with Pitt Hopkins complete the study. 3 were in the treatment group, 3 were in the placebo group initially, and then the placebo group was switched to the real treatment later. We found, again, it was very safe with minimal adverse effects. We found in GI symptoms, there was an 80% reduction in GI symptoms versus 30% for placebo. For pain, 90% reduction in pain versus 29% for placebo. For the Pitt Hopkins symptom questionnaire, which is an average of 29 Pitt Hopkins symptoms, so basically 20 autism symptoms and 9 symptoms specific to Pitt Hopkins, there's about twice as much improvement in the treatment group than the placebo. We discovered in this study that all of the children had impaired mitochondrial functioning. It was only about half of normal, and it improved substantially, not fully, but improved substantially, 26% versus 1% for placebo. And I want to thank Dr. Frye for helping with that analysis, since he's a mitochondrial expert. Also, we did mitochondria engraftment, and Dr. Khem discovered that there was 20% of the gut bacteria from the donor engrafted versus just 1%, essentially none for the placebo, and that most of those species that engrafted were beneficial species. And the exciting thing is that when we stopped treatment, the benefits continued for 3 to 6 months. In fact, in many cases, they were even continuing to improve more as time went on. So I want to share with you a direct quote from the director of the Pitt Hopkins Foundation, who wrote this letter to the FDA to support our application for why microbiota transplant should be approved for children with Pitt Hopkins. So she wrote, most children and adults with Pitt Hopkins are nonverbal. Many are non-ambulatory, meaning they're in wheelchairs. Most suffer from daily severe constipation, bloating, and abdominal pain throughout their life, which is a major factor in their quality of life. They spend their days screaming in pain from GI distress or worse, partaking in injurious behaviors that leave themselves and their caretakers at extreme risk for injury. For some, the situation has even been fatal. This MTT trial from ASU was the first clinical trial ever done for Pitt Hopkins, and the results were astonishing for the children who participated. All of the children who participated saw an improvement in GI symptoms. My own son took part in this study and went from being in pain daily to hardly ever being in pain. In his 12 years, this is the first year he enjoyed his birthday and Halloween as a result of not being in pain. Other families saw improvement not only in GI symptoms, but in mood, behaviors, and irritability. Across the board, there were no adverse side effects, and more than a year after ending the trial, the benefits are still continuing for the children. So part of the reason we did this study is the FDA has special rules for pediatric rare diseases. Pediatric rare disease is defined as one affecting under 200,000 people. Pitt Hopkins is ultra rare, only 1,400 people affected. The FDA approved our request to have MTT for Pitt Hopkins designated as an orphan drug designation, and they also approved it to be approved pediatric rare disease designation. What that means is that one small study, like the one we did, could be enough for drug approval. The example the FDA gives is if you see improvement in 3 of 12 children, that can be enough for drug approval. So the question we've asked the FDA is improvement in 6 of 6 as good as improvement in 3 of 12. So they're going to give us an answer, they tell us, in mid-July. And if they answer yes, then we're going to be allowed to submit for formal drug approval for Pitt Hopkins, and MTT will be approved by the FDA if they approve that application. So it takes about a year. But it's possible that they will say 6 children was not enough, and then we'll have to do additional children. How can we do that since most of them can't swallow pills? Well, our colleagues at University of Minnesota now made a powder version, which is highly purified. So it's minimal taste, minimal odor. You can just mix it in chocolate milk. And so we've submitted that to the FDA, and we're waiting to see if they'll approve that new version. And then we plan to, in a couple of weeks, submit an application for that to do a second study for Pitt Hopkins with the powder version. For autism, our plans are to next work on optimizing the dosing and duration. It's like with aspirin, how many aspirin do you need for a headache? Do you need a quarter an aspirin, 1 aspirin, several? So we're still learning how to optimize the dose for children and for adults. So we want to do a small dosing study first to optimize the dosing, and then we'll be ready for a major phase 3 study for adults and a major phase 3 study for children. But those are very expensive studies to do, far beyond our capability to normally raise funds through donations or other means. And that's why we have gone ahead and formed a small company, just the 4 faculty, to receive money, to request investors to invest in this company, Gut-Brain Axis Therapeutics, so we can raise the funds to do the clinical trials. We will lead the clinical trials. University of Minnesota will produce the microbiota product. And our collaborators at some other sites, such as Harvard Medical School, have agreed to participate in those studies. So our vision is that by healing the gut, we can heal the brain. We don't expect a complete cure. We expect to be able to substantially reduce autism symptoms and greatly reduce GI symptoms. So we are now seeking people who share our commitment to autism. I'm the parent of a child with autism. I'm very committed to this. We're seeking people who share a commitment to improving the lives of children and adults with autism in Pitt Hopkins, people who are qualified accredited investors. What that means is that people have an annual income of $200,000 a year or $300,000 with their spouse, or if they have a net worth of $1 million, not counting their home. So in order to even describe this to you, I have to read a special statement so I don't get in trouble with federal stock sales. This presentation does not constitute an offer to sell or a solicitation of an offer to purchase or subscribe for securities, meaning stocks. Any such offer or solicitation will be made only to accredited investors by means of a definitive document for equity or debt investment or other financing arrangement. Prospective investors should read the definitive document carefully before deciding whether to invest. So if you're interested in investing and if you qualify as an accredited investor, then I invite you to go to our website for our new company and sign up for our email list. We're beginning to have meetings next week. So if you go and sign up, then we'll go ahead and invite you to those meetings next week to learn about considering. Do you want to consider supporting the research we're doing by making an investment? If you don't qualify, but would like to make a donation instead, you can make a tax-deductible donation to ASU through our ASU Foundation. So again, I invite you to join us to help develop the first FDA-approved treatment for Pitt Hopkins and for the core symptoms of autism, and help us heal the gut and heal the brain of these millions of people who are affected. I'd like to acknowledge the help of the many participants, the many autism and Pitt Hopkins families who participated in our studies. I want to thank the many groups that provided us with funding, including DoD, Fearfully Wonderfully Made, Pitt Hopkins Research Foundation, Finch Therapeutics, Bear Foundation, Zuok for Autism Research, and over 1,000 autism families. Thank you very much. I'd also like to thank many members of our research team who have been very helpful in working with us all together in this research. And finally, I want to thank the groups that provided our microbiota capsules for these studies, Finch Therapeutics, and the team at University of Minnesota, led by Alex Koritz and Michael Sadowski. If you'd like to see our list of frequently asked questions and answers, that's available on our website at autism.asu.edu. Thank you very much.